sometimes actual acreage given to me. So the indentured servant was the one, look at the Jamestown colony, understanding its economic growth from rags to riches, that provided for it. Now, at a point in time, that labor supply shifted. And the labor supply shifted because there were fewer indentured servants willing to come over from England. Prosperity, political stability in the latter part of the 1600s, the latter part of the 17th century, allowed for England to be a good place to be, and much less so for the indentured servant to come over to America. So thus, what do we have instead? We have a replacement of the indentured servant with the slave. Now, the slave trade was one that started in the 1500s through the 1600s, perpetrated by Europe, and we've studied that last year in world history. We'll look into it as we go through American history. But the simple question of why slavery at that point in time was that the supply of indentured servants was declining, plus the prosperity of the plantation owners in America. What you have is people with the money to purchase another human being. So we see the first slave, and we'll investigate this more with the film documentary, in 1618 in the Virginia colony. But by the latter part of the 1800s, you have the wherewithal on the part of plantation owners to get the slaves and get an economic investment that makes much more sense than an indentured servant who may or may not fulfill his obligation, who may or may not be a great citizen of the community. Slaves could be brought in. Slaves could be made to work, and slaves were extraordinarily profitable if you had the capital investment to get them in the first place. How did they come over? They came over in this incredible Atlantic trading system wherein they were brought from Africa to the New World in what was called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was in fact horrific. We will again explore that more with the film documentary, but it was that awfulness that we need to know in the modern times to understand the inhumanity of the slave trade within the Atlantic trading system of the Americas. What happened when the slaves were brought over? Incredible prosperity, incredible work created by African Americans in the American colonies. And if you look at the prosperity from those colonies, from Georgia up to Maine, what you see is the lifeblood, the economic vitality made, allowed, fostered by African American slaves as they were brought over. So out of the inhumanity of the white slave system, out of the inhumanity of the slave system itself, came incredible prosperity for America. You take your pick, indentured servant, slave, know how we grew economically. Again, as I mentioned before, we had systems to choose from to follow. In fact, some of the early Puritan and Virginia settlements followed communism. But I think what we all tended to do after a short time in America was follow a capitalistic system based on the premise that I am out to make money for myself. I'm out to make sure that I can survive and prosper. And that lust, that greed, that economic focus of the American settlers manifested itself in the 1600s. And that manifestation came in what we know as the Atlantic trading system, and triangular trade is a specific aspect of it, and the simple fact that we made money off of trade. It wasn't sufficient simply to have a plantation and maybe grow tobacco or grow food for yourself. What you had to have was the ability to trade that to make more money, to turn your work into profit. And the Atlantic trading system, as it was developed, was an amazing, amazing accomplishment of Western Europe, utilizing the Americas and the resources there, Africa and the resources there, and Europe and the resources there, in setting up a system of triangular trades amongst those three locations. And that Atlantic trading system not only transformed the world, but allowed for the incredible prosperity of the American economy. The Virginia colony does not survive without tobacco, and that tobacco doesn't make itself a great commodity without the British taking that and selling it around the world in the Atlantic trading system. So as soon as you say America grew economically in the 1600s, start talking about trade, start talking about the Atlantic trading system. Understand specifically as an identification that triangular trade is what we all know. Slaves came from Africa, went to the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, it went up. And the molasses traded for the slaves was brought up to Boston and made into rum, and the rum was traded for the slaves down in Africa. That's one triangular trade system. There were so many different triangular trade systems set up at that time period with economic prosperity that you cannot believe. With those two identifications in mind, we go to the economic theory held by Europeans that dominated this Atlantic trading system. If there's an economic theory that we believe in as Americans as we came over during the colonial time, capitalism. There's another economic theory believed by the nation states of Europe in the 1600s, and that's mercantilism. And there are four basic principles of that. Principle number one, it is in the nation's interest that all economic transactions take place. Economic transactions, number one, take place for the nation's good. Contrast that with capitalism, which my self-interest dominates my activity. Mercantilism says all economic transactions take place for the nation's good. Number two, what do you need in order to have a powerful nation? And you need large supplies of gold and silver. Bullion, not that which you have on Saturday afternoons or you add as a spice to your different food sources, but bullion, gold and silver are needed. So nation determines economic transactions. Number two, large supplies of gold and silver are needed. Number three, how do you get large supplies of gold and silver? You need to sell more products than you buy as a country. You need to export more products than you import. And that favorable balance of trade became the hallmark of mercantilism for these European nation states from the 15 into the 1600s. You had to export more than you import. And for France and Spain and for many countries and different places in Europe, that worked. That could operate. But ponder if you're in English. Ponder if you're in Britain. What do you have to export in England? Not a lot. What's there? A couple sheep and some wet dirt. You can't export anything there in England. There's nothing that the world wants. So the fourth principle of mercantilism is get a colony that has stuff that you can control to export. And it now suddenly becomes clear why England took off in the 1600s, because it had the American colonies. And what was there in the American colonies that it could take and sell over the world? Well, lots of different things. Rice and indigo down south, great granaries of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. But the primary thing that it could take from the American colonies was tobacco. And so this mercantilist system was set up. Everybody in Europe believed in it. It was great economically. By the way, we weren't following it in America, because as soon as they set up the Navigation Acts to control the trade of the American colonists, what did the American colonists tell Britain to do? Please go jump in the lake. We aren't going to follow your mercantilist principles. We aren't going to follow the Navigation Acts. Therefore, we will trade on our own. And if we want to take our rice and we want to sell it someplace else, we'll smuggle, we'll cheat, and we'll lie. And that heritage of American self-interest economically, at odds with the mercantilistic nation-state interest of Britain, will eventually, 100 years later, be one of the major aspects of the American Revolution. So in summation, what do you have? You have an issue. That issue is what accounts for American economic growth? What is it that provides for our economy? Watch the campaign. Watch what Glove says. Watch what Obama says. Find out what they say accounts for economic growth in our country. Then you go back to the colonial era in the 1600s and say, what was it? Was it the fact that this incredible lust for profit through trade? Was it the incredible workers who came over, be it indentured servants or slaves? Or was it the fact that we got lucky? We have land in America. We have a frontier that allows anybody to go out there and do it. So those are the issues. The identifications have been highlighted. We'll have a test tomorrow on that material. Know it well. Thank you.